Experiencing the flavors, aromas, and sights in Chinatowns across America seems to transport one to China, or a vision of China tinted by American customs. The Chinatown in Lower Manhattan has the same effect. Tourists and Americans alike come to the neighborhood to experience most commonly the cuisine of China and Southeast Asia. But this densely packed neighborhood was not always a Chinatown, nor housed predominantly Chinese immigrants. Although immigrants occupied this neighborhood, it was not until the 1870s that a considerable number of Chinese people came into the city, not to mention the neighborhood. Before Chinese arrival in New York City, Irish, Italian, and Jewish immigrants lived in this neighborhood, then called the Five Points neighborhood because of its intersecting streets. The area had a bad reputation because of its poverty. Tenements made living conditions difficult, to say the least, because the large immigrant families who lived in them were confined in very small, poorly ventilated, and poorly lit quarters in bad condition. Despite their challenges living in the neighborhood, each immigrant group contributed some of their culture to the architecture and common space. For example, this brick building, a restaurant in the middle of Chinatown, has a Star of David on it. Symbols and traditions from multiple cultures intersected in this neighborhood. Before the Chinese came to the neighborhood, it was already diverse, yet poverty-stricken and somewhat dangerous. Chinese people began to immigrate to the western United States in the 1850s in response to the poor living conditions and politics in China. Consumers in Western countries bought Chinese resources such as silks, fur, and tea, which became a staple to flaunt wealth. But the Chinese did not do the same for Western countries' resources. To balance trade, these countries attempted to make China depend on their exported opium. The Opium Wars, the first from 1839 to 1842 and the last from 1856 to 1860, negatively affected Chinese international relations and sentiments towards other nations, and also left China in a century of humiliation. Along with hundreds of thousands of other workers searching for wealth, young Chinese men journeyed to California during the gold rush. Competition for the gold worried mainstream Americans, a feeling that initiated the foreign miners' tax law. With this new law, immigrant populations, including the Chinese, needed massive amounts of paperwork to mine or keep their mined gold. This attempt to limit the number of immigrant miners worked because these people took jobs in the railroad industry instead of the mining industry. Their awful working conditions and cheap labor helped to construct America's first transcontinental railroad. These young Chinese men worked a variety of jobs on the railroad, some unskilled tasks like moving soil and snow, and some very skilled tasks like blacksmithing, tunnelling, and carpentry. The Central Pacific Railroad Company exploited their Chinese workers by paying them less for longer hours of work than their white counterparts. In 1867, the workers struck against the railroad company to demand higher wages, a shorter workday, and precautionary shifts in dangerous working conditions. Throughout this time, mainstream America degraded Chinese in America by preventing them from joining labor unions, accusing them of stealing jobs, and demanding them unfit for citizenship. Propaganda against the Chinese in America heightened tensions and produced the Chinese Exclusion Acts. The Chinese Exclusion Acts banned Chinese workers from entering the United States, the first immigration law that excluded an entire ethnic group. The act exempted merchants, students, teachers, and diplomats, which further classified the Chinese race into either, quote, good Chinamen, the people who were exempt, or, quote, dangerous rats, the honest peasants who were excluded. This exemption was made to protect trade and treaty interests with international countries, most specifically China, in a way which solved the dispute in America between those who wanted to ban Chinese laborers and those who wanted to trade with China. Naturally, the exclusive admitted entry changed the demographic of Chinese in America. The act banned the wives and families of Chinese workmen, so a bachelor society was created. In the early 20th century, there were 4,000 men and 36 women living in Manhattan's Chinatown. This ratio was finally changed in 1960 when family unification was granted. Additionally, the Chinese men and their decisions represented China for mainstream America. Gradually, the Chinese left California to go east. Although their migration did not cease the lynching, violence, and discrimination, the separation from the West decreased the intensity of the anti-Chinese sentiments. Previously, people in and immigrants to the United States settled in the eastern part of the country first and then expanded westward, but these Chinese immigrants did the exact opposite. This explains the placement of Chinatowns most notably in San Francisco and New York City. The dramatic shift in location had a ripple effect for the Chinese in America. They had to find a way to adjust and thrive, with different opportunities for work and living areas. They naturally settled in the Five Points neighborhood because its immigrant community provided adequate protection. In this neighborhood, Chinese immigrants established restaurants and drop-off laundromats. Chinese workers owned businesses that would avoid economic confrontation with the white working class, so they would be competing with each other rather than white workers. In addition to the wealth gains, these services reintroduced Chinese Americans and China to mainstream America and helped Chinese people find their place in the country. Restaurants exposed Americans to a significant part of culture, the food. To optimize profit, however, Chinese restaurant owners tweaked recipes or invented new dishes that would be unique but still familiar enough to comfort their customers. Drop-off laundromats made life easier for customers because of the efficiency, something these self-employed Chinese thought diligently about. Before drop-off laundromats, people living in Manhattan had to ship their clothes to surrounding states and boroughs, Brooklyn, Queens, and New Jersey for the most part. In the 1920s, approximately 37.5% of all Chinese workers in New York City worked in the laundromat industry. The Chinese presence added an economic draw to the neighborhood as it transitioned to a Chinatown, but did not stop the gang violence in the streets. Gang rivalry between Tom Lee and Mock Duck made the neighborhood less and less safe. Tom Lee, Chinatown's first mayor, led the An Liang Tong in a competition with Hip Sing Tong, led by Mock Duck, for dominance in Chinatown. Tom Lee's men had a high social, economic, and political status in Chinatown, but usually gained and maintained that status from the property rights system associated with opium and gambling. Their opposition, the Hip Sing Tong, was made up of professional criminals. Tom Lee and Mock Duck's men killed each other ruthlessly. The neighborhood was immediately swept up into this gang rivalry because of the close proximity. Despite this violence, more Chinese immigrants came to America after the Exclusion Acts were repealed in 1943. It is important to note that because there were no more restrictions on who could come into America, these people came from different parts of China. For the most part, the immigrants residing in Chinatown spoke Cantonese. However, with the influx of immigrants who spoke Mandarin, a language barrier separated people in the Chinatown in Manhattan. The new immigrants, unable to integrate well into the pre-existing Chinatown, settled to the east, where there was still diversity in immigrant population and higher availability for housing. East Broadway and Eldridge Street border the two Chinatowns. In Chinatown and its surrounding neighborhoods, different immigrant groups practiced different religions. The infamous synagogues in the Lower East Side are a short walking distance away from the Buddhist temples and Catholic churches. This intersection of religions made the relationships between each more dynamic with each other, the people in the neighborhood. The different religions complemented each other. This Catholic church has sermons in multiple languages to encompass and speak to all of the community. Despite some divisions, Chinese Americans have previously and currently found shelter and aid in Chinatowns. Many Chinese immigrants, new and old, feel an increased level of comfort because of the connection to their family, to their culture, and to their country of origin. Chinatowns help immigrants transition to America be socially and economically smoother. Walking in Columbus Park, the largest and most famous park in Chinatown, the connection to traditional Chinese practices is apparent. Older Chinese men sit and play games, listen to Chinese opera, and do Tai Chi and Kung Fu. Not only do these activities bring Chinese culture into America, they also unite and strengthen the surrounding community. The park has installed Chinese chessboards, which, when a game begins, gather crowds. The casino overlooking the park and surrounding city houses practices and performances from opera clubs and martial arts groups. Chinatowns across the country have recently noticed the effects of gentrification, that their difficulty maintaining their uniqueness is increasing and their neighborhoods are gradually eroding, sometimes even disappearing. The changing demographic of these neighborhoods, populated by a new generation of Chinese Americans eager to live similar lives to mainstream America, challenges the connection to China and Chinese culture in these neighborhoods. Socioeconomic changes in the surrounding areas add to the pressure Chinatown in Manhattan is facing. Since the 1980s, wealthier groups are relocating to and dominating these neighborhoods. In downtown Manhattan, Chinatown is the last low-income community. However, community efforts to combat this gentrification have worked, and even strengthened the community. People in Chinatown take part in new and old community organizations and associations that unite and subsequently oppose gentrification and housing development through street petitions and lawsuits. Additionally, some characteristics of Chinatown make the area unfavorable for well-off buyers of real estate. Chinatown, just like any neighborhood in this country, reflects the people living in it. Chinatowns across America give Chinese immigrants adequate space and opportunity for success in a way which does not require complete immersion to American culture. Although the treatment of Chinese in America throughout history is shameful, the establishment of Chinatowns is admirable and necessary for the continued prosperity of the Chinese and everyone else in America.